Waves crashed violently against the rocky shore, the sound of the ocean roaring in Tom's ears as he sprinted down the beach. The salty wind whipped against his face, and his boots sank into the wet sand with every hurried step. Ahead of him, tangled in a mess of seaweed and debris, lay a seal pup, its small body trembling as it let out desperate cries. The tide was rising quickly, and each wave crept closer to the helpless creature, threatening to pull it back into the relentless ocean. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he dropped to his knees beside the pup, his hands fumbling to untangle the sticky seaweed wrapped tightly around its flippers. The seal's wide, glassy eyes stared up at him, filled with fear and pain. Its cries were weak but persistent, a heartbreaking plea for survival. On the edge of the roaring ocean, where life and death danced in unison, one fisherman made a decision that would change the course of this struggling creature's life forever. Tom worked quickly, the cold water splashing against his legs as he freed the seal's injured flipper. The pup shuddered, its small body heaving with exhaustion, but there was no time to waste. The waves were relentless, each one crashing closer than the last. Tom glanced over his shoulder at the vast, wild sea, its power undeniable, its danger clear. Just hours earlier, the beach had been calm. Tom had started his morning like any other, checking his fishing nets along the shore as the first light of dawn painted the sky. The ocean, though unpredictable, had always been a part of his life, a place of both sustenance and peace. But today, it seemed the sea had something else in store for him. A faint cry, unlike anything he'd heard before, had drawn him toward the water's edge, where he first spotted the struggling pup. The seal had been swept ashore by the unforgiving tides, a victim of the wild ocean. And though Tom had seen the harshness of the sea many times, something about this fragile creature stirred a determination he couldn't ignore. As the story unfolds, the audience discovers not only the seal's fight for survival, but the extraordinary bond that would form between man and animal. This was no ordinary morning. It was the beginning of a journey that neither of them could have foreseen, one filled with challenges, compassion, and a race against time. The faint, high-pitched cries echoed through the salty morning air, barely audible over the rhythm of the crashing waves. Tom slowed his steps, scanning the shoreline with a growing sense of unease. The sound didn't belong. It wasn't a bird, nor the usual hum of the ocean. It was something alive, something in pain. His eyes locked on a dark shape near the water's edge, half buried in seaweed. At first, he thought it might be driftwood, washed up by the relentless tide. But as he moved closer, the shape stirred, and a soft, heartbreaking cry reached his ears again. It was a seal pup, small and fragile, lying motionless on the damp sand. There it was, nature's harshness laid bare. A young seal swept ashore by the tide, its tiny body battered by the ocean and its strength fading fast. Alone and vulnerable, the pup clung to life, its cries a desperate plea for help. Tom crouched beside the pup, his heart sinking as he took in the scene. The seal's flippers were tangled in thick seaweed, its movements weak and uncoordinated as it tried to free itself. Its breathing was shallow, its glossy eyes darting between Tom and the approaching waves. The tide was rising again, each wave creeping closer, and the seal seemed too exhausted to resist. Tom reached out cautiously, speaking softly to avoid startling the pup. "Hey, little one, it's okay. I'm here to help." His voice carried a mix of determination and compassion, though he knew the seal couldn't understand his words. Slowly, he began untangling the seaweed from its flippers, his rough fisherman's hands working with a gentleness he rarely needed in his daily life. The seal flinched at first, letting out another faint cry, but it didn't fight back. It was too weak, its small body shivering as the cold wind swept over the beach. Tom noticed faint scratches along its sides, likely from being tossed against rocks in the surf. One of its flippers had a fishing line tangled tightly around it, cutting into the skin. He cursed under his breath, pulling out his knife to cut the line free. Every mark on the seal told a story of the ocean's unforgiving power and the damage humans left behind. Tom couldn't change what had happened, but in that moment he made a choice. He wouldn't let this pup become another casualty of the sea. As he worked, Tom glanced back toward the water. The waves were growing stronger, and the rising tide was a relentless reminder that time was running out. The seal needed more than just to be freed. It needed care, warmth, and strength to survive. But here, on this remote stretch of beach, help felt miles away. When he finally freed the seal from the seaweed and fishing line, Tom gently placed his hand on its side. The pup's breathing was still labored, but there was a faint glimmer of life in its eyes, a spark of hope that gave Tom the resolve to keep going. The seal had been delivered to his path by the sea itself, and as Tom looked into its eyes, he knew that fate had given him a responsibility he couldn't ignore. The question now was, how far would he go to save it? Tom stood, carefully lifting the pup into his arms, its small body limp but trusting. The ocean roared behind him, but he turned away from the waves, his mind racing with possibilities. The fight to save the seal had just begun. Tom stood on the shoreline, the fragile seal pup cradled in his arms, its soft, labored breaths audible over the crashing waves. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, vast and indifferent, while the pup's fragile body trembled against his chest. Tom could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. What should he do next? His instincts screamed for him to act, but the path ahead was anything but clear. The ocean had always been a part of Tom's life, a source of sustenance, challenge, and respect. But now, it had presented him with a choice: leave the seal to fend for itself, or risk everything to save a life that was slipping away with each passing moment. Tom glanced back at the water. The tide was rising quickly, waves crashing closer with every cycle. Returning the seal to the ocean seemed unthinkable. It was too weak to swim, and the rough surf would swallow it whole. But the beach wasn't much safer. The cold wind, predators, and sheer isolation meant the pup had little chance of survival here either. He knelt down, setting the pup gently onto the damp sand as it let out another faint cry. The seal's wide eyes looked up at him, pleading without words, and Tom felt his chest tighten. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. His mind raced with questions. Should he try to get it back into the water? Should he leave it here and hope for nature to take its course? Or should he intervene, knowing that any interference might complicate things further? Tom had seen the cruelty of the sea before, nets that ensnared the innocent, fishing lines that left lasting scars. He had always accepted it as part of the life he'd chosen. But this time, it felt different. This time, he was the only one who could make a difference. The pup shifted slightly, its small flippers weakly pressing into the sand as it tried to move closer to Tom. The sight tugged at his heart. For a moment, he hesitated. What if trying to help made things worse? What if he couldn't save it after all? He had no experience caring for wild animals. All he had was his gut, and even that felt unsure. But as he looked down at the trembling creature, a wave of resolve washed over him. This wasn't just a matter of survival. It was about doing what was right, even if the odds were against him. "All right," he said softly, crouching back down beside the pup. "I'm not leaving you here." In that moment, Tom made a decision, not just to save the seal, but to fight against the indifference of the wild, to prove that even in the face of uncertainty, compassion could make a difference. Tom carefully scooped the pup back into his arms, its small body leaning into him as if it understood that he was trying to help. He knew he had to act quickly, but the questions lingered. Where could he take it? How far could he go before his efforts became futile? He glanced toward the distant cliffs where his fishing shack stood, nestled near the rocks. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. If he could get the pup there, maybe he could buy it enough time to recover before figuring out the next step. As Tom began the trek up the beach, the seal let out another soft cry, its voice weak but persistent. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the seal's weight, but because of the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He wasn't just a fisherman anymore. He was this pup's lifeline. With every step, Tom felt the gravity of his choice. The ocean had brought this fragile creature into his life, and now it was up to him to see it through. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let the sea take this life without a fight. As the waves roared behind him, Tom pressed on, his mind filled with uncertainty, but his heart set on one thing: giving the seal a chance. Tom reached a shallow stretch of beach where the waves gently rolled onto the sand. The seal pup, cradled in his arms, let out soft, wheezing cries as it struggled to lift its head. Tom knelt down by the water's edge, the cool tide rushing over his boots. He placed the pup gently on the wet sand, watching as it instinctively tried to move toward the ocean. The pup managed a weak shuffle, its small flippers pressing into the sand, but the effort was short-lived. The waves pushed against its body, knocking it sideways. The pup let out another faint cry, too tired to fight back. Tom's heart sank as he saw the sheer fragility of the creature. It was alive, but barely. Instinct told the pup to return to the water, but the ocean had already taken so much from it. Each wave was a reminder of how relentless the sea could be, pushing the young seal farther from survival with every crash. Tom splashed into the water, gripping the seal's sides to steady it. "Come on, little one," he murmured, his voice strained with determination. He gently guided the pup forward, holding it upright as another wave rolled in. For a moment it seemed like the seal might gain its footing. But as the water deepened, the current pulled harder, and the pup's body faltered, its head dipping under the surface. Tom pulled the seal back quickly, lifting it out of the water and onto his chest. It coughed and sputtered, the small noise breaking the tension of the moment. Tom's brow furrowed as he carried the pup back to the shore, his boots sinking into the sand. This wasn't going to be as simple as he'd hoped. The ocean, vast and merciless, didn't care about second chances. And for the young seal, survival wouldn't come easily. Tom was beginning to realize the depth of the fight ahead. He placed the seal back on the sand, the waves still licking at its flippers, and sat beside it, trying to think of another plan. The pup looked up at him, its eyes wide and filled with exhaustion. It was clear that the seal wasn't ready for the water. It needed time to regain its strength. But time wasn't on their side. The tide was creeping closer, and the cold air was beginning to bite. Tom glanced around, his gaze falling on an old tarp tangled with driftwood farther up the beach. He stood quickly, retrieving the tarp and draping it over a patch of dry sand to create a makeshift shelter. He carried the pup carefully to the spot, laying it down on the softer ground and covering part of its body with the tarp to shield it from the wind. Tom had always seen himself as a fisherman, a man of the sea. But today, the tide had shifted. He wasn't just an observer of nature. He had become a participant in its harsh, unpredictable rhythm. The seal's breathing began to steady under the shelter, and Tom used his hands to splash small amounts of water over its body to keep its skin moist. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of fish he'd brought along for his morning, and held it out. The pup hesitated, sniffing weakly before nibbling at the fish. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Tom knelt beside the seal, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The sea wasn't giving up easily, but neither was he. This wasn't just about the seal anymore. It was about proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, compassion could make a difference. Every step felt like a battle against nature itself. But for Tom, the fight wasn't over. The seal had shown him its will to survive, and now it was his turn to match that determination. Tom sat back, watching as the seal rested, its breathing more even now. The waves continued to crash in the distance, but for the first time, Tom felt a flicker of hope. This was just the beginning of their journey, and while the sea had tested him, it hadn't won. Not yet. The soft rustle of the waves and the gentle breeze carried a calm that seemed to seep into the makeshift shelter. Tom sat cross-legged on the sand, just a few feet away from the seal pup, who was now resting under the tarp he had set up. Its breathing had steadied, and though it still looked weak, there was a spark of life in its wide, glossy eyes. The pup watched Tom with a quiet curiosity, as though it was beginning to recognize that he wasn't a threat, but a lifeline. In the wild, trust is rare, but here, on this quiet stretch of beach, man and animal began to bridge the unspoken divide. The seal, fragile and wary, was slowly learning that kindness could exist in a world that had shown it nothing but struggle. Tom leaned forward, holding out another small piece of fish he had salvaged from his morning catch. The seal hesitated, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. After a moment, it shuffled closer, its flippers awkwardly dragging along the sand, and took the food from Tom's hand. A small smile tugged at his lips as he watched the pup chew, its hunger finally starting to override its fear. "You're tougher than you look," Tom said softly, his voice carrying a mix of admiration and relief. "We'll get you back on your feet, little one." The pup made a soft noise in response, a faint cry that wasn't as weak as before. It was as if the seal was trying to communicate, to show its growing comfort in Tom's presence. Over the next hour, as the tide continued to rise in the distance, Tom busied himself keeping the seal hydrated, gently pouring water over its back to prevent its skin from drying out. Each time he reached over, the pup flinched less, eventually leaning slightly into his hand as if seeking reassurance. With every small gesture, the bond between them grew stronger. What had started as a desperate cry for help was now becoming something more. A fragile connection built on trust and survival. As the sun began to climb higher, its rays piercing through the thin clouds, Tom sat back and stretched his legs. He glanced over at the pup, who was now lying on its side, its flippers tucked close to its body. The seal blinked up at him, and for a brief moment, Tom felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about saving a seal anymore. It was about protecting a life that had placed its trust in him. "You remind me of myself, you know," Tom said with a chuckle, his voice soft and contemplative. "Out here, trying to figure things out, just you and the sea." The pup tilted its head slightly, as if it understood. Tom shook his head, smiling at his own words, but the moment felt oddly significant. He hadn't expected to feel this kind of connection. He was just a fisherman, used to the practical, unforgiving life of the sea. But this pup, with its fragile hope and quiet resilience, had stirred something in him. Tom had spent his life working against the ocean, hauling its bounty, battling its storms. But now, for the first time, he felt a partnership with it. The seal wasn't just a creature of the wild. It was a reminder of the fragile balance that tied them all together. The pup shuffled closer to him, nudging its small head against his arm, before settling back down under the tarp. Tom froze for a moment, surprised by the gesture, before gently resting his hand on its side. It was warm, alive, and trusting. That single moment, simple yet profound, solidified the bond between them. As the hours passed, the pup grew stronger, its movements more deliberate, its cries more confident. Tom could see the transformation happening before his eyes, and he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a shared journey, one that reminded him of the power of compassion in a world that often demanded indifference. On that quiet stretch of sand, Tom and the seal found something unexpected: hope, trust, and the realization that even the smallest acts of kindness can build unbreakable connections. The tide continued to rise, and though Tom knew the pup couldn't stay on land forever, he felt ready to face whatever came next. For now, they had found peace in each other's company, and that was enough. The day had started to brighten, the sun casting shimmering reflections across the waves. The seal pup, now more alert, rested in the shelter Tom had created. It had begun to move its flippers with more energy, and for the first time, it seemed like recovery was within reach. Tom sat nearby, watching the pup with quiet satisfaction, a faint smile on his face. But just as he began to feel hope settle in, a movement in the water caught his attention. A dark, ominous shape was circling in the shallow waves not far from shore. Tom squinted, his stomach tightening as the shape came closer, and then he saw it. A sleek, triangular shark fin slicing through the water, its menacing presence unmistakable. The predator wasn't just passing by, it was lingering, as if it had picked up the scent of something vulnerable. Nature, in all its beauty, is also ruthless. The seal pup, once battered by the sea, now faced a new danger, a predator lurking just beyond the shore, waiting for its moment to strike. Tom's breath caught as he glanced back at the pup. The little seal, unaware of the danger, let out a soft cry and shuffled slightly under the tarp. It was still too weak to defend itself, let alone escape. Tom clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had come too far to let this happen. The shark's fin moved closer, the shadows circling in an almost deliberate rhythm. Tom stood up, his boots sinking into the wet sand, and moved instinctively to position himself between the water and the seal. He knew he couldn't fight off a shark, but he also couldn't let the pup return to the water with a predator so close. Tom had spent a lifetime respecting the ocean's laws, knowing that predators and prey were part of its natural balance. But this time, he couldn't just stand by and let nature take its course. Tom picked up a long piece of driftwood from the shore, gripping it tightly as he kept his eyes on the water. The shark's fin continued to circle, closer now, its sleek body just beneath the surface. His pulse pounded as he shouted toward the waves, hoping to scare it off. "Go on, get out of here." His voice carried over the sound of the surf, but the shark didn't budge. The seal pup stirred behind him, letting out another faint cry. It was as if the little creature could sense the tension in the air. Tom turned briefly to check on it, his heart sinking as he saw its wide, helpless eyes fixed on him. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. He was all that stood between the pup and the predator. In the wild, every moment is a test of survival. And for Tom, this wasn't just about the seal. It was about proving that compassion could stand against even the fiercest of odds. For what felt like an eternity, Tom kept his position, shouting and waving the driftwood as the shark circled. Finally, the fin began to move away, its path shifting farther from the shore. Tom held his breath, watching intently as the shadow disappeared into the deeper water. Only then did he allow himself to lower the driftwood, his shoulders sagging with relief. He turned back to the pup, kneeling beside it as the tension in his chest began to ease. The seal looked up at him, its small, fragile body still trembling but safe, for now. Tom let out a shaky breath, resting his hand gently on the pup's side. "We're not out of this yet," he murmured, his voice soft but determined. The predator was gone, but the danger wasn't over. The seal's survival would depend on more than just strength. It would take resilience, trust, and the will to keep fighting. Tom stayed close to the pup, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the shark's return. The waves continued their endless rhythm, but the beach felt quieter now, almost as if the ocean itself had taken a breath. Tom knew they couldn't stay on the shore much longer. The tide was rising, and the pup needed to return to the water eventually, but not until it was ready. As the sun climbed higher, Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. The ocean had tested him, thrown challenge after challenge in his path. But he wasn't ready to give up. The seal pup had shown him its will to survive, and now it was his turn to do the same. In the face of the ocean's might, one man's determination and one seal's resilience were enough to stand against the odds. Together, they had weathered another trial, but their journey was far from over. Tom leaned back against the driftwood shelter, his gaze shifting between the pup and the water. The shark might have moved on, but the lesson it left behind was clear. Survival wasn't just about strength, it was about the bond between those willing to fight for each other. The tide was rising quickly, the waves creeping closer with each passing moment. Tom stood at the water's edge, the seal pup cradled gently in his arms. The little creature had grown stronger over the past hours, its cries louder and its flippers twitching with renewed energy. But now the moment had come. The moment Tom had been working toward. It was time to return the pup to the ocean. Tom knelt down in the shallow water, the cold surf splashing against his boots. He set the seal down carefully, his hands steadying its small body as it adjusted to the feel of the waves again. The pup let out a tentative cry, its flippers moving hesitantly. Tom watched, his heart pounding, as the young seal tested the water, its instincts slowly kicking back in. Every journey has its turning point, and for the seal, this was it, a chance to reclaim its place in the wild. But the ocean, as beautiful as it was, could still be unforgiving. A gentle wave rolled in, and the seal flinched at first, its body tense. Tom leaned in, speaking softly. "You can do this, little one. You're stronger than you think." The seal seemed to respond, lifting its head and letting out a louder cry. It flapped its flippers, pushing against the water, but it still lingered close to Tom as if unsure. Tom stayed in place, his knees in the water, ready to intervene if needed. He glanced out at the horizon, scanning the waves for any sign of the predator he had seen earlier. The water was calm now, but Tom's nerves were still on edge. He knew the pup had to go. It couldn't stay on the shore forever, but letting go wasn't easy. Tom had done everything he could, but the final step was the hardest. He had to trust that the seal, fragile as it seemed, was ready to face the wild again. With one final nudge, the seal moved forward, the waves gently pulling it deeper into the water. Tom watched as it paddled awkwardly at first, then more confidently. The pup's small body bobbed with the rhythm of the waves, and for a moment it seemed to hesitate, turning back to look at Tom one last time. Tom felt his chest tighten. That glance, brief, fleeting, felt like a silent thank you, a recognition of the bond they had shared. He raised a hand, his voice soft. "Go on, little one. You've got this." The seal let out one final cry before diving beneath the surface. Its small, sleek body disappeared into the blue, leaving only gentle ripples behind. Tom stayed kneeling in the water, his eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for any sign of the pup. And then, just as he began to doubt, a small splash broke the surface farther out. The seal popped up briefly, its head turning as if to reassure him before it disappeared again, this time swimming confidently into the open sea. In that moment, Tom felt a mix of pride and sorrow. The seal was gone, but its journey wasn't over. And though the wild was unpredictable, it was also where the seal was meant to be. Tom stood, brushing the water from his hands, and took a deep breath. The ocean stretched out before him, vast and endless, but he didn't feel small against it anymore. He had given the pup a chance, a second chance, and that was enough. As the waves washed over his boots, Tom turned back toward the beach, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The seal was back where it belonged, and the bond they had shared, though brief, was something he would carry with him forever. Sometimes the wild reminds us of the fragile balance between life and loss, and sometimes it shows us that even the smallest acts of kindness can ripple out into something extraordinary. Tom walked away from the water, the sound of the waves fading behind him. The seal was gone, but its story wasn't. It was a story of survival, of trust, and of one man's determination to make a difference, even when the odds seemed impossible. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the beach as Tom stood there, watching the ocean. His heart still raced from the moments that had passed, but a deep sense of calm was beginning to settle in. The seal was gone, swallowed by the vast sea. Tom knew it was the right thing, the only thing. Yet part of him couldn't help but feel the weight of their brief but powerful bond. Letting go is never easy. But sometimes, the wild teaches us that true compassion doesn't mean holding on. It means giving the freedom to return, to be who they are meant to be. Tom turned his back to the water and began walking slowly back toward the small shelter he'd built earlier. His boots sank into the wet sand, each step echoing in the quiet of the beach. The faint sound of the waves continued behind him, but it was different now, more peaceful. The storm of uncertainty had passed, and he felt a quiet connection to the wild that he hadn't expected. His gaze drifted to the distant waves, where the seal had disappeared, his mind replaying the moments they'd shared. The seal's fragile body in his arms, the way it had slowly come to trust him, and the proud moment when it finally swam free. Tom hadn't just saved the seal. He had witnessed its journey back to the wild. And in doing so, he had been reminded of something deep and profound, the power of a single life to change the world around it. Tom reached the edge of the beach, where the rocks met the sand, and paused to look back one last time. A part of him wanted to see the seal again, to know it was safe and thriving out in the open sea. But he knew that wasn't his place. His role had been to guide it to safety, to give it a second chance, and he had done that. The rest was up to the ocean, the wild, and the seal itself. With a quiet, almost imperceptible smile, Tom turned away from the shore. His journey as a fisherman had changed that morning. He had given more than just time and effort. He had given part of his soul to a creature who needed him. And in return, the wild had shown him the beauty of letting go. Narration. In the quiet of the ocean, with nothing but the sound of the waves to guide him, Tom realized that some of the greatest journeys aren't about where we're going, they're about what we leave behind. A single life saved, a bond that will last forever. As Tom walked back up the path to his small fishing shack, the world around him seemed a little quieter, a little more meaningful. He had given the seal a chance, and in doing so, had found something within himself that he hadn't known was missing. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, but for the first time, he didn't feel small against it. He had made a difference, and that was enough. Sometimes, it's not the grand victories or the battles we fight that define us. It's the quiet moments, the ones where we choose compassion over everything else, that remind us what it means to truly live. As Tom walked away from the shore, the sound of the waves fading behind him, he carried with him a quiet sense of fulfillment. The seal was back where it belonged, free to live and thrive in the vast ocean. What had started as an ordinary morning had turned into something extraordinary, a reminder of the deep connection between humans and the wild and the power of a single act of kindness. In saving the seal, Tom didn't just help a struggling creature, he rediscovered something within himself. Compassion, resilience, and the strength to make a difference, even in the face of uncertainty. Sometimes it's the smallest lives that leave the greatest impact. Tom paused for a moment, turning back to glance at the horizon one last time. The ocean, endless and unpredictable, felt different now. It wasn't just a place of struggle. It was a place of possibility, where even the most fragile creatures could find their way back. This story is a reminder that even in the wildest, most uncertain moments, we have the power to change a life. Every small act of kindness ripples outward, creating a world where compassion can thrive. If this story touched your heart, share it and let others see the beauty of giving back to nature. As Tom disappeared into the path leading away from the beach, the camera lingered on the waves, the sun reflecting off the water. It was a simple moment, but it held a powerful truth. Even in the vastness of the wild, one life, one decision, can make all the difference.